Joaquim El Chapo Guzman, finally captured a few weeks ago in Mexico.
El Chapo once ruled an empire of fear, smuggled tons of narcotics, and escaped the world's most secure prisons twice.
A notorious Mexican drug lord escaped prison through a sophisticated tunnel.
He escaped from prisons no one thought could be penetrated, but now there is nowhere left to run. Inside one of the most secure facilities in the United States, every movement, every breath, and every word he utters is controlled and monitored.
A secretive installation in Colorado.
Famously been called the cleaner version of hell.
To escape means overcoming layer after layer of impenetrable walls.
What kind of life awaits a man who once commanded nations from the shadows? Join us as we unveil how a once dangerous drug lord is treated in prison. The capture of a kingpin. Before the world called him El Chapo, Joaquin Guzman was just another boy in the rugged mountains of Sinaloa, Mexico, born into a family of subsistence farmers. But in those hills, corn wasn't the only crop that thrived. The region was part of Mexico's Golden Triangle, where families like Guzman's grew opium poppies and marijuana to survive. From a young age, he learned the trade. First tending fields, then ferrying product along dusty trails. By the late 1970s, Guzman was working under Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, the powerful founder of the Guadalajara cartel. But when Gallardo was arrested in 1989, his empire splintered into factions. Out of that chaos emerged a new power called the Sinaloa cartel, and El Chapo quickly became one of its rising lieutenants. He built his reputation on ruthless efficiency and logistical genius. Where others relied solely on bribery, El Chapo innovated by creating elaborate smuggling tunnels under the US-Mexico border, hidden compartments in trucks, and even custom-built submarines. By the mid-1990s, his network was moving tons of cocaine and heroin into the United States every month. That level of scale helped grow his reputation. In some parts of his home state, he was even regarded as a folk hero. As a local boy who had made good outsmarting the rich and powerful and giving back to communities where the state had failed. At the same time, the media described him as the face of an organization with tens of thousands of members and billions in profits. El Chapo even appeared on Forbes' list of billionaires in 2009. At that time, he was both invisible and untouchable. Yet no ghost can hide forever. His first arrest came in 1993, after the killing of a cardinal exposed his movements. Sent to Puente Grande prison, he spent 8 years behind bars before escaping in 2001, allegedly inside a laundry cart, aided by guards on his payroll. That early escape made him famous as the man who could slip through the system. But the escape that shook Mexico didn't happen until 14 years later, on the night of July 11, 2015. El Chapo disappeared from the high-security prison known as the Altiplano Federal Penitentiary in Almoloya de Juarez. Surveillance footage captured him last in the shower area of his cell, a section not covered by cameras. Authorities soon discovered a tunnel, more than a mile long, 10 meters deep in places, equipped with lighting, air ducts, and even a motorcycle mounted on rails to carry supplies or speed his escape. The tunnel's discovery was a humiliation for the Mexican government. The official account described how the tunnel began under the shower floor of his cell, ran under the prison walls, and emerged at a construction site in the neighborhood. The government immediately launched a massive manhunt. On January 8, 2015, Mexican federal forces finally recaptured El Chapo as he attempted to flee on foot. Helicopters and special forces surrounded him during a raid in Los Mochis, ending weeks of regional bloodshed and marking the beginning of the end for the kingpin's reign of freedom. The next bold move was extradition. On January 19, 2017, El Chapo was flown to the United States, landing at Long Island MacArthur Airport in Islip to face federal charges, including leading a continuing criminal enterprise and importing tons of narcotics into the country. The moment he arrived in the United States, stripped of power and flanked by armed agents, El Chapo's fear was unmistakable. No longer the elusive phantom slipping through walls and tunnels, he was now fully in U.S. federal custody. The question hung over everyone watching. If he had escaped Mexico's maximum security prisons twice, what kind of facility could contain him this time? The unbreakable prison. Located in the remote high desert of Colorado, ADX Florence is the United States' only federal super maximum security prison, built for the most dangerous inmates. Officially, the United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility is operated by the Federal Bureau of Prisons. Nicknamed the Alcatraz of the Rockies, it is known for its isolation and fortress-like design, reflecting its purpose: to contain those who pose a severe threat to national and institutional security. ADX Florence houses some of the most notorious criminals in U.S. history, including Zacarias Moussaoui, a 9/11 conspirator, and Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, convicted for the Boston Marathon bombing. Placing El Chapo among terrorists, spies, and serial killers underscores the magnitude of his threat. His history of escapes now meets a facility long regarded as escape-proof. Since opening in the mid-1990s, no inmate has successfully fled. By sending him here, the U.S. government signals that the man who once defied borders now faces a fortress designed for absolute control. Each inmate cell measures roughly 7 by 12 feet, is constructed from poured concrete and steel, and is furnished only with a fixed bed, desk, stool, shelf, and a stainless steel toilet sink combo. The cell window is a narrow vertical slit that allows faint light but no view of the outside world. Most inmates spend 22 to 23 hours a day confined. In the most restrictive wing, Range 13, which houses El Chapo, meal trays are delivered without contact and cell doors are remotely operated. Daily life at ADX itself is part of the punishment. Wake cell, minimal movement, back to cell. Guards monitor through cameras and remote controls. Movements are rarely in groups, most of the time is spent alone. Any sense of change, spontaneity, or connection to the outside world is stripped away. For a man who once commanded vast networks, smuggled tons of narcotics, and escaped maximum security prisons, this isolation represents a profound reversal of power. Even recreation is another form of confinement. Instead of an open yard, El Chapo is taken to a small, caged, concrete enclosure, open to the sky but surrounded by high walls, often underground or heavily enclosed, with no view of the horizon, no contact with other inmates, and strict supervision. Legal and administrative measures compound his isolation. Special administrative measures, authorized under 28 CFR subsection 501.3, restrict communications when an inmate poses a substantial risk of death or serious injury. In El Chapo's case, the SAMs exclude his preferred counsel, ban almost all non-legal communication, and severely limit contact with his wife and children. Mail, phone calls, visits, and media interactions are tightly controlled or barred entirely. In April 2024, he requested restoration of phone calls and visits, noting he had been cut off from his family. These measures sever any remaining ability to coordinate the networks he once commanded. The combination of physical isolation, a tiny cell, hours alone, and strict legal restrictions reduces El Chapo's former power to near total confinement. The pressing question remains: how has this relentless isolation affected his physical and mental health? The mind in isolation. El Chapo's attorneys have repeatedly warned that relentless isolation is eroding his mind. In letters to federal judges, they report that he shows cognitive decline, memory lapses, anxiety, depression, and paranoia. In a 2017 filing, defense attorney Michelle Gellert noted that he often repeats himself and forgets the topic of conversation, a deterioration she directly linked to total human separation. Another motion described him hearing music in his head when none exists, an early sign of auditory hallucinations. His legal team emphasizes that this is not mere emotional distress, but a measurable breakdown of mental faculties. They report that he struggles to concentrate and warned that, without relief, he could eventually be found mentally incompetent to participate in his own appeals. Such symptoms, memory loss, confusion, and auditory distortions align with clinical studies on long-term solitary confinement. For a man once celebrated for his strategic genius and mastery over vast criminal networks, these filings represent the ultimate defeat, not by rival cartels or law enforcement raids, but by time, silence, and the slow unraveling of the mind. His descent from feared kingpin to fragile inmate shows the psychological violence inherent in perpetual isolation. Attorneys also highlight the body's response. Defense records and medical complaints describe hypertension, chronic headaches, joint pain, insomnia, and muscle deterioration. In 2017, lawyers noted difficulty breathing, sore throat, and headaches. A 2016 medical exam in Mexico had already documented anxiety and sleep deprivation from stress and sensory deprivation. Physicians and human rights observers note that prolonged stress produces physiological effects akin to trauma, elevated cortisol, cardiovascular strain, and accelerated aging. Even without physical violence, isolation can trigger psychosomatic collapse, where mental distress manifests as real physical deterioration. The Bureau of Prisons has declined to release detailed medical records, citing privacy. Independent experts, however, compare his reported symptoms to patterns observed in long-term ADX prisoners. Harvard psychiatrist Dr. Stuart Gracian, who has studied supermax confinement, described inmates experiencing intense agitation, impulse control difficulties, dizziness, heart palpitations, and muscle wasting. El Chapo's case may not be unique, but rather a vivid illustration of isolation as a slow, measurable form of bodily decline. Critics question whether this deterioration is accidental or deliberate. Some argue ADX's regime of permanent solitude is intended to extinguish will, not merely secure the inmate. The 2012 lawsuit Cunningham versus Federal Bureau of Prisons alleged deliberate indifference to mental health, claiming staff knowingly left prisoners to deteriorate. The settlement required expanded psychiatric services, implicitly acknowledging systemic harm. Human rights groups, including Amnesty International and the Center for Constitutional Rights, argue that El Chapo's confinement under special administrative measures exemplifies the same logic: containment so absolute that recovery is improbable. Former ADX warden Robert Hood bluntly described the facility, "It's not designed for humanity." This perspective frames the prison's function not as correction, but corrosion, ensuring figures like El Chapo can no longer influence, command, or inspire. Viewed this way, El Chapo's decline resembles a strategy of erasure, a form of bureaucratic disappearance in which the inmate lives but ceases to exist in any meaningful sense. The man who once moved billions in narcotics now struggles to hold coherent thoughts. Facing this steep decline, what legal avenues has he pursued to challenge his treatment? The legal battle. In 2021, El Chapo filed a lawsuit from behind bars against the U.S. Department of Justice and the Federal Bureau of Prisons, accusing them of violating his constitutional rights. His attorneys submitted the case in the U.S. District Court for the District of Colorado, arguing that the conditions of his confinement amounted to cruel and unusual punishment under the Eighth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. The filing painted a bleak picture of life at ADX Florence: no direct human contact, no sunlight, no family visits, no phone calls beyond rare legal ones, and a 23-hour daily lockdown. His defense claimed that such extreme isolation was psychological torture, especially for a man already sentenced to life in prison. In one statement, El Chapo's legal team wrote that he had been subjected to inhumane conditions that served no legitimate purpose of punishment or deterrence. But the government's restrictions are designed not for security but for vengeance. The U.S. government wasted no time firing back. To them, this case was not about mercy. It was about necessity. In a written response, the Department of Justice argued that El Chapo's treatment was fully justified, even essential. They reminded the court and the world that this was the same man who had escaped twice from maximum security prisons in Mexico, once by hiding in a laundry cart and again through a mile-long underground tunnel dug directly into his cell shower. The DOJ's statement read that the defendant remains a uniquely dangerous individual with a demonstrated capacity to orchestrate criminal operations, including escapes from inside prison walls. His isolation is not punitive, it is preventative. They went further, noting El Chapo's long record of corrupting officials, his ongoing influence over members of the Sinaloa cartel, and the risks to national security if he were allowed even minimal contact with the outside world. But El Chapo's lawsuit, like the many escape attempts before it, hit a dead end. The courts showed no sign of leniency. In January 2022, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit upheld both El Chapo's conviction and his sentence, including the prison's restrictive conditions. The judges ruled that the measures were appropriately tailored to the extraordinary security risks posed by the defendant, effectively ending any hope of transfer or relief. El Chapo's legal team promised to appeal to higher courts, even hinting at international human rights complaints. But experts say the odds are vanishingly small. Still, his lawsuit has forced one uncomfortable question back into the public debate. If America's prison system is meant to uphold justice, where is the line between security and cruelty? And if El Chapo truly deserves this fate, then we must ask, what exactly did he do to earn it? The crimes of the century. For a moment, the lawsuit almost makes us forget who the man behind the bars really is. But to understand why the U.S. government has shown no mercy, we have to go back to the courtroom where the world watched his empire crumble. The trial that revealed the whole terrifying truth of Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. In 2019, Brooklyn, New York, became the stage for what prosecutors called the trial of the century. For 3 long months, federal courtrooms buzzed under lockdown. Security was unlike anything seen before in U.S. legal history. The Brooklyn Bridge was shut down every time El Chapo was transported from his cell to the courthouse. Armed U.S. Marshals sealed off entire city blocks. Even inside the courtroom, the jury sat anonymously, their identities hidden from the public to protect them from retaliation. No cameras were allowed inside, but reporters described the atmosphere as something out of a spy thriller. Federal agents with earpieces, bulletproof vehicles, and a courtroom packed with some of the most dangerous witnesses ever assembled. The man once considered untouchable was now surrounded by steel and silence. The U.S. government had brought a 17-count indictment against him, charging him with everything from drug trafficking and money laundering to murder and organized crime. It wasn't just a trial, it was a global reckoning. Then came the testimonies, each one peeling back another layer of El Chapo's empire and of his cruelty. Over 14 cooperating witnesses, many of them former cartel members or close allies, took the stand. Their stories were so shocking that reporters had to pause between notes. They told of rivals buried alive, tortured for days, and executed in front of their families. They spoke of mass graves filled with victims who had crossed the Sinaloa cartel. One witness recounted how El Chapo ordered his men to burn enemies alive after forcing them to confess. Another described a warehouse used for dissolving bodies in acid, a chilling reminder that his reign wasn't just about drugs, it was about domination through fear. Prosecutors also presented physical evidence of drug dealing. Each shipment was worth millions, each crossing coordinated under El Chapo's direct command. He controlled an empire that stretched from the jungles of Colombia to the streets of Chicago, responsible for an estimated 25% of all illegal drugs entering the U.S. at its peak. In one trial transcript, a witness quoted El Chapo himself saying that nothing happens in Sinaloa without his word. It was not bravado. It was a fact. The courtroom listened in stunned silence as the inner workings of the Sinaloa cartel unfolded like a movie, complete with secret tunnels under the U.S.-Mexico border, hidden compartments in trucks and planes, and coded radio networks used to coordinate shipments. By the time the prosecution rested, the evidence wasn't just overwhelming, it was terrifying. But perhaps the most unsettling part wasn't the violence, It was the corruption that made it all possible. Witness after witness detailed the staggering scale of El Chapo's reach into Mexican law enforcement and politics. Millions of dollars in bribes flowed to officials at every level: police commanders, soldiers, prosecutors, and even government ministers. Former top aide Alex Cifuentes testified that El Chapo personally paid a $100 million bribe to then-President Enrique Peña Nieto, a claim the former president denied. Still, it showed the kind of fear El Chapo inspired and the deep cracks in Mexico's institutions that allowed him to rise. It became clear why the United States treats him differently from any other prisoner. His power didn't end with prison bars. It was built on loyalty, intimidation, and endless money. Even locked away, El Chapo represented a unique risk, the possibility that corruption could find him again. That's why, at ADX Florence, he is cut off completely. No visitors, no phone calls, no second chances. The government isn't just punishing him, it's protecting itself from him. But for a man who had always found a way to escape, the world waited to hear the one thing he could never outrun. What was the final, definitive judgment from the court? The final judgment. On July 17, 2019, in a heavily guarded federal courtroom in Brooklyn, the long and violent saga of El Chapo reached its final chapter. When Judge Brian Cogan asked if he wished to speak, El Chapo raised his head and delivered what would become his last public statement, where he declared that his confinement had been an act of torture and that he had been denied a fair trial and justice. He accused the United States of corruption and bias, claiming that his isolation at ADX Florence amounted to psychological torment. Yet across the courtroom sat the families of his victims, people whose children had died from the narcotics he trafficked or whose loved ones had disappeared in cartel violence. Some wept, others glared at him in silence. One mother reportedly whispered that she hoped he would never again see the sun without bars. After reviewing months of testimony and evidence detailing murders, bribes, and torture, Judge Cogan announced the inevitable: life imprisonment plus 30 years, with no possibility of parole. The punishment was accompanied by an order for El Chapo to forfeit $12.6 billion, a sum calculated by prosecutors to represent the cartel's drug revenues over the years. Outside the courthouse, U.S. Attorney Richard P. Donahue told reporters that the blood of thousands was on El Chapo's hands. For a man who once declared, "No cage can hold me," the irony was absolute. Not only would he spend the rest of his life behind bars, but his empire would crumble piece by piece while he watched from isolation. One thing was clear: the era of El Chapo was over. His story of crime and punishment is complete, but what will ultimately be the enduring legacy of his imprisonment? The man, the myth, and the system. While El Chapo remained locked up, his sons picked up where he left off, arguably even more ruthless, learning from their father's capture. When the Mexican government attempted to arrest them, the cartel sons showed they would do anything to evade detention. The 2019 Battle of Culiacan offered a chilling glimpse into the Sinaloa cartel's capacity for urban warfare. On October 17th, Mexican special forces launched an operation in the affluent Tres Rios district to apprehend Ovidio Guzman, son of Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. The elite GF unit breached the safe house, subduing guards and detaining Ovidio within minutes. On paper, it was a decisive blow. But the operation quickly spiraled into chaos. Encrypted communications mobilized over 700 armed cartel operatives within half an hour, wielding 50-caliber machine guns, rocket-propelled grenades, and improvised armored vehicles. Roadblocks of burning buses severed key routes, gunfire rained from elevated positions, and armored trucks rammed police vehicles. Civilians fled as the streets became a battlefield, while cartel lookouts provided real-time intelligence to outmaneuver government forces. By late afternoon, the Special Forces team holding Ovidio was encircled. More than 150 vehicles had been mobilized across multiple neighborhoods, revealing the Sinaloa cartel as a paramilitary organization capable of large-scale urban combat. Facing mounting casualties and hostage threats, President Andrés Manuel López Obrador made a controversial decision. Ovidio was released. The cartel had shown that a single figure could bend national policy through violence. Alongside his brothers, collectively known as Los Chapitos, Ovidio assumed control of the cartel. He oversaw finance, logistics, and technology, managing millions through hidden accounts and couriers. By 2019, at just 28, Ovidio had become a defining figure, fusing modern technology with ruthless tactics. Encrypted phantom-secure phones and private radio networks coordinated operations and jammed military communications during the Culiacanazo. His digital systems tracked shipments and finances, transforming the cartel into a sophisticated, adaptive enterprise. Ovidio also built a disciplined fighting force. Recruits from Sinaloa's poorest communities were trained in advanced weaponry and organized into units capable of coordinated assaults. Rapid deployment in Culiacan demonstrated military precision rarely seen in criminal organizations. His financial network laundered profits through small businesses and cash transfers, masking the cartel's true scale. In many regions, the organization acted as both employer and protector, further complicating intelligence efforts. U.S. authorities took notice, particularly due to Ovidio's role in trafficking fentanyl, linked to over 80,000 overdose deaths in 2021. Determined to prevent a repeat of Culiacan, Mexican and U.S. authorities captured him on January 5, 2023, in the Jesus Maria district during Operation Mongoose Azteca. Months of intelligence sharing allowed precise tracking of his movements. In a pre-dawn raid, helicopters and armored vehicles breached his residence, and within hours, Ovidio was in custody. 17 associates were also captured. The operation involved the Mexican Army, National Guard, and Navy. He was flown under heavy guard to the Altiplano Maximum Security Prison, the same facility that once held his father. Violence erupted across Sinaloa. Gunfire, burning vehicles, and roadblocks in Culiacan, Los Mochis, and Guasave. By dawn, 10 soldiers, 19 cartel gunmen, and 1 police officer were dead. Nearly 3,600 troops were deployed, seizing Barrett rifles, machine guns, and armored vehicles. The United States responded swiftly. The Office of Foreign Assets Control imposed sanctions under Executive Order 14059, freezing assets linked to Guzman Lopez's supply chain, including chemical suppliers for fentanyl and methamphetamine. Secretary of State Antony Blinken called it part of a broader effort to dismantle the global machinery behind America's opioid crisis. By late February 2023, the U.S. formally filed for Ovidio's extradition. 7 months later, he was transferred to the United States to face sweeping drug charges. On July 11, 2024, inside Chicago's Dirksen Federal Building, Ovidio pleaded guilty to multiple counts of drug trafficking and operating a criminal enterprise. His sentencing remains sealed, as he reportedly cooperates with U.S. authorities, trading information for the one thing his family's empire could never buy: time. Thanks for watching. Now check out the videos popping up on screen for more unbelievable stories.